and I'm going to introduce our panelists really quickly. Gönül Tuğ is the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Center for Turkish Studies. She's also an adjunct professor at the George Washington University's Institute for Middle East Studies. Thank you for doing this. Renda Salim is the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute and a non-resident fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies. General Michael Nagata retired from the US Army in 2019 after 38 years of active duty with 34 years in the US Special Operations. After graduating from the National War College, he served in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence until 2005. And Mohammed Baharoun is the Director General of Dubai Public Policy Research Center, Buhuth. Established in 2002 in Dubai, he pursued a career in media where he worked as a reporter for leading cultural monthly Al Arabi magazine, a writer for Al Ittihad, and then as an editor for Gulf Defense magazine. We're lucky to have you all here today. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming. So for better or worse, when we usually here in the States look at conflicts in the Middle East, we look at them through one of three lenses, either through the lens of the post-revolutionary Iran competition sectarian lens, or we look at them through the lens now of the post-Arab Spring, i.e. lack of political, socioeconomic representation and local issues, or we look at them at the lens of US intervention or lack thereof, US leadership or lack thereof, depending on the situation and the perspective. And that's usually not necessarily a very accurate way to look at these conflicts, and usually there's an overlap in some of this. But given that this is the way that we view these conflicts, I'm interested in hearing what you all have to say about how they can be de-escalated and whether this is an accurate lens to look at them or not. I'm going to start first with Gönül because we have Erdogan across the street. He's meeting with Trump today. So we should start with that. A member of NATO meeting with Trump, even though it's very hard to find any fan of Erdogan in the US Congress on either side. So the main question is, can Turkey play a constructive de-escalatory role in the Middle East? And also, is this meeting a good thing or not? And where do you see it going?
Well, a larger question to be addressed for the purposes of this panel is your first question, whether Turkey can play a constructive role in the region. Well, Turkey did play a constructive role in the region when Ankara pursued a non-ideological, pragmatic regional policy. When Turkey used trade and investment to expand its influence in the region. When Turkey could be able to talk to not only the Western world, but also every actor in the region, from Hamas to Israel, from Iran to Egypt to Saudi Arabia to Qatar. So there was a time before the Arab uprisings when Turkey did play a very constructive role. But that's not the case anymore. Starting from Turkey ceased to play that role when it was an actor that advanced stability in the region, when it started pursuing an ideologically driven foreign policy. Ideologies and nationalism in particular generate aggressive foreign policies. Starting from 2011 with the Arab uprisings, Turkey pursued a very ideologically driven foreign policy. Initially, it had a very Islamist agenda. And that's why Turkey sought Islamist victories in countries like Egypt, in Tunisia, and in Syria. But from 2015 on, nationalism became the guiding principle of Turkey's regional policy. And the devastating implications of Turkey's ideologically driven foreign policy were most visible in Syria. Turkey launched 3 military incursions starting from 2016. And we can talk about the implications of those. Among many, it displaced thousands of people. But also Turkey became one of the key actors that militarized the conflict in Syria by providing weapons and aid to Islamist groups, including jihadi actors. So Turkey also helped jihadization of the conflict in Syria, and also exacerbated the already strong tension between Arabs and the Kurds. So that's why I think since 2011, initially it was an Islamist foreign policy. Later on, it became a nationalist foreign policy. Turkey has not been playing a constructive role, and in fact, it's contributing to the destabilization of the conflicts in the region. So I think as long as nationalism remains Erdogan's key strategy at home to remain in power, Turkey will not be able to play that role. And with regard to your question about Trump-Erdogan meeting and whether that can resolve anything, well, reportedly President Trump will offer a trade deal in return for a ceasefire in Syria. But whether that will really prevent conflict and produce real results on the ground is questionable at best, because Turkey's Turkey's fight against the Kurdish militia forces in Syria is really helping Erdogan at home. It's one of his key strategies. His entire domestic strategy rests on dividing the opposition and driving a wedge between the main opposition party and the pro-Kurdish party. And it has worked so far. Since the Turkish military incursion, his support is up by 4 points. And there has been tension between the main Turkish opposition party and the pro-Kurdish party. So this strategy has been working for him at home. And that's why whatever President Trump promises, it might be really difficult to implement. But I think the key question here is American presence in northeastern Syria really prevented Turkish efforts to extend the fight against the YPG forces into the eastern part of the river. And now that there are still American forces around Deir ez-Zor, but since that announcement, US announcement to withdraw troops from Syria, we have been seeing that announcement paved the way for conditions that are in which conflict is more likely in the short term. You have the regime troops there, the Russians. So before that announcement, northeastern Syria was a relatively stable region, one of the very few stable regions in Syria. And since Turkish military incursion and US announcement, we've been seeing skirmishes between Turkish forces and Kurdish forces, between Turkey-backed forces and Assad forces. So I think at the heart of the problem is the US decision to withdraw, and how that created a lack of credibility on the ground.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to go to Mohammed right now to tell us a little bit more about ways of de-escalating tensions with Iran. And then I'm going to ask you about the Yemen question later. But since the U.S. has pulled out of the nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, especially the shipping sanctions, the oil sanctions against Iran, there have been these Iranian acts of aggression in the region. Is it important to de-escalate? What are the ways to do it? And just give us your general thoughts about this administration's policy towards Iran and whether that's been helpful or not for the Gulf states.
Thank you, Muna, and thank you for MEI for staging this discussion on the concept of stabilization and stability, which is not usually discussed. I have to start by saying that escalation and de-escalations are both tools in a box. And that's a box that policymakers use to deliver their objectives. So you can de-escalate and you can escalate, but you have an objective. So de-escalation or escalation are both pathways to an objective. And in this sense, sometimes we forget this. and we think at de-escalation as an objective in itself. It should be a means to an aim rather than an aim in itself. And in this discussion, you could look at something like JCPOA, which was supposed to be a means to a more comprehensive stability in the region, a pathway to that stability, and it didn't happen. It became an aim in itself. It became an objective. So looking at it from that prism, you need to see that what is happening so far is a different tool of using or achieving an objective. When it comes to Iran, there has been a de-escalation not from the UAE, not from the US. I think everyone have used self-restraint as a means of we can see that a lot of things could have happened after the first attack in the ships against Fujairah. Could have seen that a lot could have happened militarily. Escalation when Gig was attacked. But none of that has happened. The UK response, the US response, the Saudi response, the UAE response, all has been towards de-escalation. But this escalation here is not an aim in itself. It's part of a wider, at least that's how I see it, a wider strategy where Iran as a nation state is not touched, but Iran's ability to operate outside Iran is what is being targeted. And if you look at that, then I think what is happening so far, including the sanctions, has been going into the same direction. Iran is less capable of supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's less capable of supporting the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. And it's also less capable of supporting the Houthis. And we could see that things are drawing into different directions right now. So de-escalation, self-restraint might not be an attempt of saying, yeah, as General Votel said, kumbaya moment. It's actually a tool, a step towards a different outcome. So that's the way I see how the GCC countries, particularly, is handling the Iran issue. And I don't think it is totally, separated from everything that the US or the UK or Europe are doing.
And is this a good policy?
Okay, outcomes decide whether a policy is good or not. You can think about it. You could say, this is my best shot. And we will have to see. There are very good signs so far. But the signs is not that Iran would come and sit on a table and say, yes, we will have an agreement. What you need to look for is that once an agreement is achieved, how can you guarantee that it's going to be implemented? In any contract between you and me, I have to rely on a governance model that would say if you back down on your agreement, there is something that was going to guarantee that you stay in line. And without those lines, without those ability of a governance system, without those guarantors, then that's problematic to achieve it. Now, is the guarantor going to be the US? Is the guarantor going to be Europe? Is the guarantor going to be Russia? Is the guarantor going to be China? Is it going to be all of the above? I don't know. This is a discussion that I think is going on and an assessment that's continuing.
Thank you so much. Renda, I'm going to ask you some questions. You know, what's happening in Lebanon and in Iraq with demonstrations sometimes are looked at from that specific lens of that region, specific localized problems that people are protesting against. But then also they're looked at from the perspective, the wider issue of Iranian intervention, Iranian-backed proxies or groups or networks. Is this kind of wishful thinking, or is this true? Or is this part of the equation? And what are the ways to solve these problems? If you could talk about that.
Thank you. I think both of these levels that you are talking about, which is the domestic contestation of power between citizens and state, and the external role, especially Iran, in terms of its role in Iraq, which is much deeper, much, much deeper and much more complex in Iraq than, in my opinion, is the case in Lebanon, and I can talk about the differences. But I want to quote a statement by Gramsci, which, in my opinion, explains the situation in both Iraq and Lebanon. And quote, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." I think the old order is dying in both countries. And by old order, I mean the power sharing agreement, which was negotiated between expat Iraqis and with the help of the United States during the occupation of Iraq in 2003 through 2005. That old order, the youth of Iraq who are protesting in the street are saying, this order does not serve us anymore. This needs to be changed. However, we don't know where they are. What's the alternative? The same thing in Lebanon. The Ta'if Agreement, which ended the civil war in 1989. Again, the youth protesting in the streets of Lebanon are saying that agreement between these corrupt elites no longer serves us. But again, what's the alternative? So we are in this interim period between an old order that is no longer working and the need for a new order that needs to emerge. And that needs to be negotiated somehow. This transition needs to be negotiated between these two camps, between the protesters, civil society, leaders, and between the governments. Now, until now, in both cases, the protest movement has been leaderless, and that has been problematic. On one hand, I hear the argument from protesters that if leaders were to arise, they are going to be under physical security threats, which is the case. Lebanon has a track record of assassinating opposition. The same thing in Iraq. We are seeing peaceful activists being kidnapped, disappeared, and people being shot at. So there is this need to basically keep this protest leaderless for now, partly to preserve whatever leadership can emerge in the future. But however, the longer this leaderless movement continues, the more potential, the higher the potential for political opportunists, good or bad, to try to ride this wave in both Iraq and Lebanon, and the higher potential for groups, for protests, which really have transcended sectarian divisions in both countries, for people to fall back on the sectarian affinities. In periods of unrest, if it is protracted unrest, the psychological tendency of people is to revert back to what they are comfortable with. And in both cases, it's sectarian ghettos and sectarian identities. So hence, the challenge going forward is for this protest movement to develop a leadership core. They have advanced a number of demands, and it's amazing the similarities in both cases in terms of the demands they want. They want basically resignation of the cabinet, which happened in Lebanon. They want the appointment of a transition cabinet, non-partisan technocrat, which where the challenge is, in both cases. And where Iraq definitely, we see that Iran is coming on the side, there will be no change in government. In Lebanon, I think, again, this is the tug of war between the governing coalition, of which Hezbollah is an important member, and the protesters. They want early elections. They want new electoral law in both cases that create space for new political faces and leaders to enter the electoral arena. But again, the longer there is no leadership, the harder it's going to be able to translate this into some kind of electoral wins going forward. So one path, the only path forward, the way I see it, it has to be negotiated. There needs to be negotiation between these two camps. Who's going to mediate this negotiation? In Iraq, the UN has put forward a roadmap for this negotiation and presented itself as the mediator. In Lebanon, we have yet to see a a mediator arise. We have I think yesterday, a French official came to Lebanon and to meet with maybe a representative, with the government as well as a representative. Maybe France will offer itself, but I still think that this is something that needs to be negotiated by the Lebanese between them. I mean, I could see a third party made up, or a committee of judges and constitutional scholars and economic experts coming together and, trying to mediate between the protest movement on one hand, the leaders of it once it's formed, and the government. Now, in terms of Iran, I think again there is because this lens of everything through Iran, we try to see the developments in Lebanon and Iraq as being the same if we use this Iran lens. However, I think Iran's role in both in Lebanon and Iraq is different. In Iraq, Iran sees what's happening today as an existential threat to its presence. And I think they are going to resort to whatever to quell this uprising. And why do they see it as an existential threat? Iraq has always been a source of threat to Iran. And so any kind of unrest, turmoil that can upend the status quo, which has been extremely favorable to Iran, fashioned by Iran, is going to be a threat. But more importantly, it is Shia youth who suspended their demonstration after the first wave to go and march in Arba'in. You are not going to be able to get more Shia than this, okay? Who are protesting against Iranian presence, who are in the streets of Karbala burning Iranian consulate and Iranian flag. I mean, this is read, I bet, in Tehran, especially within the IRGC offices, as something that is totally unfathomable, few weeks ago, and so for this to happen, that is something that Iran will not be able to allow to continue for a long time. And so I think the strategy right now is to try to push all the protesters in one, basically, square, the Tahrir Square, isolate them. Hopefully the elements, wind, rain, whatever, can take care of that. But at the same time, as they have been doing until now, engaging in basically kidnapping of activists and all of this. In Lebanon, until now, Hezbollah does not see these protests, although Shia majority communities have engaged in these protests. And this is the first time, because in the past, when Shia communities engage in protests, it's usually mobilized by Hezbollah. So this time you have Shia communities who are not necessarily raising the slogan against Hezbollah, against Birri, Aoun, the allies of Hezbollah, but indirectly, basically, raising a slogan against Hezbollah. But this still is not an existential threat to Hezbollah. And that's why we see, for example, the Secretary General, we see all the leadership trying basically to put forward political proposal. And once this turns into an existential threat, and I would think if the protests within the Shia community expand and can sustain themselves and start attacking Nasrallah and Hezbollah themselves, then I see no qualms of Hezbollah to use force to put an end to it. They've done that in 2008, and whenever there is an existential threat, they are going to do whatever to basically deal with it. In 2008, with the incursion in the streets of Beirut, when they felt that their communication system was threatened, and we saw what they have done in Syria to basically put an end to what they felt an implosion or a regime change in Syria as being an existential threat to them. So this is where we are. We are in this period where, morbid symptoms are going to happen, However, I want to just one last point. I want to add to what General Votel said and comment not only on the maturation of if we can put it, the protest street. And I'm talking here about Lebanon. I mean, the tactics that these young protesters have been evolving, the non-violence tactics, the way they have been developing a narrative to unify people around shared interests is just amazing. And that speaks a lot to the investment that have been put since the end of the Civil War in civil society work, in promoting nonviolence methods, citizen participation, citizenship education. But at the same time, I want to compliment the professionalism of the Lebanese armed forces. And I think that also speaks to the investments that this country has put over the years in military education and training of the Lebanese armed forces. And look, there is a split screen that the Lebanese, saw. There is, on one side of it, thugs, which have been fielded by Hezbollah and Amal to break down the protest. And on the other side of the screen is Lebanese soldiers putting themselves in middle as human shields between the thugs and the protesters, trying to protect the protesters. This is not a scene that has been lost on the Lebanese, and that goes a long way. If there is one positive side, one positive outcome of this contest today in Lebanon is the increased trust in the professionalism and capacities of the Lebanese armed forces across all Lebanese.
Thank you, Renda. And I'm going to get back to you with some other questions about regional de-escalation. But first, I'm going to go to General Nagada. And I kind of want there's always this overarching question about whether tensions in the Middle East or conflicts in the Middle East are boiling over because the United States is not either intervening enough or is not taking a leadership role. On the other hand, people will say, or is it the opposite, that the U.S. is taking too much of an interventionist role in the Middle East? So that there's always those conflicts and tensions, and there's always the question of how does it go from one administration to the next. So how do you assess leadership role in the U.S., its role in these conflicts, and what can be done to de-escalate?
Thanks for the question, and thank you to the Middle East Institute for allowing me to be here once again. It's a great pleasure to be among my distinguished panelists and to see all of you. I must confess it is also a little terrifying because a former Army special operator and former boss of mine happens to be sitting in the front row, General Votel, and I am mindful of the fact that I need to remember that nothing ruins a good story like an eyewitness. So I've got to be very careful about what I say here. But you're asking a really important question, and I'll try to be brief about this. I really have, I think, two general observations to share with everyone. And this is the fruit of the fact that although I've spent much of my career in the very region we're talking about, number one, I cannot possibly compete with the expertise of my colleagues on this panel, so I'm not even going to try. But I have deployed 4 times to one of the most complex and occasionally hostile regions of the world, and that's called Washington, D.C. I've done 4 tours in this town. I bear the scars. Most recently, I was the director of strategy at the National Counterterrorism Center. So let me begin with a first observation. I do believe that the American presence and hopefully useful American activity in the region is both good for the region as well as General Votel eloquently stated, necessary for protecting very important interests the United States has there. But what I believe I've observed in the 4 deployments I've made to this capital has been a gradual attenuation, maybe even deterioration of our ability and our willingness to understand that the various vectors, influences, events, and trajectories in the Middle East are all interrelated with each other. It's very intellectually inconvenient. It's far more convenient for analysts and policymakers and military officials like myself who serve in Washington, D.C., to believe these are discrete cylinders of activity that do not bear any relationship with each other and certainly don't affect each other. If that's true, then our ability to formulate effective policy gets exponentially easier. But like I often tell my kids, or told my kids when they were going through school, that's also intellectually lazy because it's not true. And some very brief examples that I've seen lately that I thought I would list for all of you. Whatever you may think, whatever anyone may think of the recent policy choice to withdraw a substantial number of our forces from northern Syria, that just doesn't affect either our counter-ISIS campaign or our prospects inside of Syria. It has regional and extra-regional consequences that are very inconvenient. But I've watched people in DC, certainly in my last position, I watched people struggle to grasp the fact that this has an incredibly complex set of consequences that far exceed simply our ISIS campaign or our local interests regarding Syria. Another example is the rise in both tensions as well as physical attacks from Iran or Iranian-sponsored actors against the interests of our Gulf Cooperation Council state partners. That is a very worrisome trend, but it is absolutely connected to all these other things that are happening in the Middle East, some of which have already been articulated here. Again, intellectually convenient to treat all of this as a cylinder of activity, intellectually lazy and counterproductive when it comes to formulating effective policy. So what Americans need to do, this is my personal diagnosis, certainly people in this town, need to realize that this intellectual laziness is not serving us well. That yes, it is much harder to try to grasp how all of these various actions, mishaps, accidents, and tragedies in the Middle East all affecting each other. But if we're not willing to grasp that, the likelihood we'll be a useful actor in changing the trajectory in the Middle East goes down precipitously. The final thing that I wanted to say is really an extension of what I just said, but I'm going to use, for those of you that are familiar with a term called net assessment, it's something that actually the Department of Defense formulated many years ago. It was a way of considering the strategic environment, and it generally broke down into a three-color code scheme: red, green, and blue. Red being whoever our adversary is, green being the environment, and blue being ourselves. And in some of the early writings about net assessment, a truth was spoken that I think is still true today. Dealing with the adversary is hard. Understanding and dealing with an increasingly complex environment is even harder. But the hardest one of all is to understand ourselves. And this is where I have seen, again, a gradual but very clear deterioration over several administrations now. But U.S. senior official and policymaker willingness, desire, and ability to see ourselves as clearly as we should. And what happens when someone doesn't see themselves clearly? They generally start engaging in very wishful thinking. They tend to think they're more awesome than they actually are. They tend to think that problems that they are grappling with are easier than they actually are. And they completely misunderstand their own strengths, their own weaknesses, their own durability, their own risk tolerance. And this has become, in my personal opinion, this has become a plague on our ability to formulate effective policy and strategy.
Give me an example of how that can happen.
Well, I wrote down several examples. Let me see what the best one is. Well, here's one. Again, personal opinion here. But I used to, not too long ago, I only retired 90 days ago, I used to be in many of these conversations. I'm not going to reveal any classified information here, and I doubt anybody in this room is going to be surprised by this. It's a matter of public record that the current administration stipulated soon after it came into office that the combination, that one of our most important goals when it came to this region was to reduce what we typically call Iranian malign behavior, right? Whether that's activities of the IRGC Quds Force or the activities of Lebanese Hezbollah or what have you, we weren't articulating we wanted it to go away or that we saw a path for making it go away, but we certainly wanted to significantly reduce it. And I agree with that personally. But the formulation which was being articulated publicly and privately was there are only two things that need to happen here. Number one, we need to withdraw from JPOA, and we need to create a maximum pressure campaign that does not cause a armed conflict with Iran, but will use other instruments of national power in partnership with allies and friends in the region and outside the region. And the combination of withdrawal from JPOA and these mostly non-military activities would inexorably cause a change in the strategic calculus in Iran. Does anybody believe that's happened? And there were people in these early discussions, I count myself among them, who were saying, I agree with your goal. I just don't see how this mechanism gets us to that goal. And what I got a face full of was, I'm going to give, again, personal opinion here, but this is the way I interpret what I was told. I'll use a shorthand version. Nagata, you don't understand how awesome we are. Okay. You're right. I don't understand how awesome we are. And that's a blue problem. So sorry, I went on a little too long there.
That's fantastic. Thank you for all of our panelists for these wonderful remarks. I'm going to go to some of our questions. We have about 11 questions here, and then I will ask you some more of my own questions here. Mohammed, this is a question for you. What are the prospects for political dialogue between Iran and the Arab Gulf states, i.e. UAE and Saudi Arabia?
Well, this is, in a way, started happening. The question is not what are the prospects of that happening, but what is the prospects of that leading to something meaningful. And for that to lead to something meaningful, as I said, you need to agree on a number of issues, but you also need or commitments, but you also need a guarantor for that. This is, for instance, was the problem that we faced with Qatar. We had an agreement with Qatar in 2014 with some certain outcomes, but there was no guarantor for that outcome. And when Qatar backed down on some of its commitments, we had to go back to the same conditions we had at the beginning. Now, with a lack of a guarantor, that is going to be the problem.
Is the lack of guarantor, i.e. the US is not playing the role of the guarantor that it should play? Who should be this guarantor?
Well, at this point, the discussions we're having are the discussions about regional security cooperation structures. What are the regional security structures or mechanisms available for us? And those that are right now on the table might not have one particular that would solve everything. I mean, people are talking about MESA, there's talk about Sentinel program, there's a talk about HOPE, which is the Hormuz Peace Initiative, there's a talk about the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden entity, there is talk about, an OSCE-like type of organization. None of these is an easy selection. And the point is that who would actually say if this particular party does not commit to what it committed to, we have certain consequences that can be, that is a problem. But for something like that to happen, you need to give and bring back. One of the major things that happened to Iran, for instance, is that after Ahmadinejad, after a long attempt, particularly by the GCC countries, particularly by the UAE, to engage with President Khatami and President Rafsanjani to bring Iran into the blood circulation, let's say, of the world economy. Ahmadinejad came in and insulated Iran, so influence in Iran became much more difficult.
And I know that Renda wanted to address this too.
Well, at the Middle East Institute, we have been working for some time on this track 1.5 regional dialogue involving, again, current, former senior officials and experts from GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and recently Qatar, Turkey, Iran, and some Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. And I think the challenges which have always marred regional dialogues is the fact that this trust deficit between the parties, which you have talked about. The other challenge is, again, the lack of convening mechanisms, processes. We have had in the region a number of regional security organizations, regional political organizations, and all of them have really failed to deliver. There are no institutional conflict prevention mechanisms in the region that can work. GCC was the one organization that was still working, and with the conflict between Doha and Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, this basically, I'm not saying ceased to operate, but it has become much less effective given the divisions. Now, Oman and Kuwait have played in the past the role of mediators. However, I think there is really now an opportunity, and I just came yesterday evening from Abu Dhabi, and Mohammed was with me at that conference where Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Dr. Gargash, spoke, where he spoke of there is this opportunity right now to launch this dialogue. And it was not clear to me whether it is regional only, i.e. GCC plus Iran, or whether it's a GCC plus Iran plus the P5+1, so that was not clear, at least in his presentation, but it opened the space. And there, what he talked about is that the pathway forward is for an inclusive discussion of all the issues that have divided the region, correct? It's the regional intervention, number one, and second, it's the nuclear and missile file of Iran. I think partly this new opportunity is driven partly, in my opinion, and Mohammed might disagree with me. On one hand, there is a realization in the Arab region, and I'm not saying only in the Gulf, but throughout the Arab region, that basically America is retrenching from the region. And this has started with President Obama's pivot to Asia, and then the 2013 decision not to enforce our red line, and then the withdrawal from Iraq, before that in 2011, and recently the flip-flop in northeastern Syria by the Trump administration, and the lack of really immediate response to the Abqaiq attacks. There is this realization of questioning, I think, in the region of the reliability and reliability of American commitments to its partner, and add to that the confusion about what are the U.S. interests and objective. And I think that has created an incentive for at least GCC countries and Arab region to explore, different pathways. On Iranian side, I think there is also, there has always been a push for a regional level dialogue to push the America out, but there is also, I think, Iraq and Lebanon have shown Iran, and especially IRGC, the limits of their proxy strategy, I mean, if Iraqi Shia youths are protesting against you in Iraq, there are limits to how far this investment in proxies can serve you in the long term. And that created some incentives.
Great. So we've got about 10 or so minutes, maybe 15 minutes. No, it's fine. I'm going to ask some questions, and if you could keep your remarks brief, and then I'm going to ask you all a question at the end. This is for Gunal. How should the United States and NATO engage Turkey to ensure a more constructive role in Middle East policy? Has Russia become a better aligned and more important partner for the Turkish regime?
Well, in Western capitals, we have been seeing and hearing this debate more often, whether Turkey is, we talk about Turkey's pivot to Russia and talk about the question of whether Turkey is going to be leaving NATO anytime soon. And my argument, my answer to that is that NATO still is very important to Turkey. It's, for instance, in regions like the Black Sea. Black Sea is a region where you see the tension between Turkey and Russia. So yes, it's true that Turkey has cultivated very close ties to Russia in recent years, working very closely in Syria, and now it expanded that cooperation to defense sector. That's all true, but it doesn't mean that Turkish-Russian partnership is without any problems. There's a lot of tension, and again, the Black Sea region is one of that. Since 2014 annexation of Crimea, for instance, the power balance there has changed dramatically in favor of Russia. And Turkey sees that as a major threat. Before 2014, Turkey used to be the dominant naval power there. it's not anymore. Russia is the leading power there, and Turkey changed its policy to address that threat. Before 2014, Turkey has always pursued a policy of excluding NATO and the West from regional initiatives and the Black Sea, because Turkey thought that that it could play a leading role there, and the Western and NATO presence would overshadow that role. So that's why Turkey kept NATO out of the Black Sea. But after 2014, Turkey has changed that policy and now trying to bring NATO back, and supported several regional initiatives to have a stronger NATO presence in the Black Sea. And that in itself shows you how there's a lot of tension between Turkey and Russia, and Turkey is threatened by Russian presence. And Russia is also using that boosted military presence in the Black Sea to help its efforts in Eastern Mediterranean, which is another very important region for Turkey. And it's also using for its efforts in Syria. So I think that's why NATO is still very important for Turkey. But the key question here is, I think, Turkey-Russia partnership is not a strategic alliance yet, but it could become one, and it will depend on both the Western world and NATO's next steps. There are several bills on the Hill, including arms embargo, that are trying to punish Turkey and Russia.
Good idea, bad idea?
It's a bad idea, because I think it will further push Turkey to Russia. Turkey will definitely survive an arms embargo. It did in the 1970s when the US imposed an arms embargo. And what did Turkey do? Turkey relied on its own defense sector and built up its own local defense industry. And work with other partners. And Turkey will do the same. So it's not really going to punish an arms embargo by Western powers is not going to punish Turkey. It's going to reward Russia. Turkey will turn to South Korea, which is already going on, to Pakistan, and more important, to Russia. Turkey is now considering purchasing Su-35s from Russia. So imagine if you pass bills, if you sanction Turkey, like the CAATSA sanctions, that will make Turkey more willing to work with countries like Russia. So it's a terrible idea.
All right. I have a question on Yemen for Mohammed. Can there truly be a de-escalation of regional hostilities, particularly with regards to Iran and Yemen, while MBS reigns as the crown prince? How should the US deal with MBS going forward? And you can also just answer this question more generally about dealing with Yemen.
Yeah, I mean, a very important consideration to have when you look at the region is that the Arab Gulf states countries are not an Arab Gulf countries. They don't see themselves as the countries that are bordering the Arab Gulf alone. They look at themselves as the Arabian Peninsula. And with the Arabian Peninsula, there is the Arabian Gulf, there is the Arabian Sea, and there is the Red Sea. We've seen the engagement across the region based on that type of realization of the new geostrategic space, be it in Sudan, be it in Egypt, be it in Ethiopia, also with Iran, up with Iraq engagement. The major component of that strategy is to understand that this is a world system, world order that's based on the nation state. So the idea not of nationalism, but of nationism, that is now very obvious in what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Lebanon. People are, identifying themselves with their own flag. This is a counter argument to the transnational approach for both Iran and Turkey. Turkey is using Muslim Brotherhood, Islamic orientation to project its ability or influence across the region. And this is exactly what the UAE, particularly Saudi Arabia and others, are saying, that we cannot deal with this. The world system is based on nation states. So Yemen is important for Saudi Arabia because it's the entire south of the Arabian Peninsula. It's in our best interest that Yemen subsidize, that Yemen becomes stabilized, and that Yemen becomes an important factor of that. If you look at the recent initiative by Saudi Arabia to establish the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden security alliance, that Gulf of Aden brings in not only the Red Sea, but the Arabian Sea as well. So that's an important strategic positioning for the entire Gulf nations. And Yemen is an integral part of that. Turkey is an integral part. That's why, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria. There is a new calibrated approach to Syria that is based on that type of understanding of this entire region and how important it is for the East and the West, how important is it to India, to China, to Japan, but also how important it is to Europe, to Africa, and all the way to South America.
Can I have one thing to this?
Go ahead, please.
Again, personal opinion here, but an improved trajectory regarding Yemen requires all the participants to agree to something that would collectively improve this.
Correct.
In my view, there is absolutely no reason for the Iranians to move in that direction. Yeah. In my opinion, if I were an Iranian leader, I would view what has happened in Yemen over the last several years as a magnificent strategic accomplishment that has had manifold benefits for Iran. Why on earth
I give it up.
would I want to stop?
Very interesting. I have two questions for you, General. From the audience, of course.
Yes.
So, what would be an appropriate policy for the U.S. to follow that achieves the goal of changing Iran's strategic calculus in the region? And I have another question for you, on kind of, not exactly, but in a similar vein. Hold on. Scrolling. How can the U.S. Can the U.S. use the current popular agitation in Lebanon and Iraq to reduce Iran's influence in the region? So those two questions.
Oh, that's a good question. Hold on. I'm going to write this down so I don't forget. The current protests.
Yes. And just more broadly, the question about changing Iran's calculus.
Right. This is probably going to be actually both of the things I'm going to say are probably going to be dissatisfying. On the question of changing Iran's strategic calculus, this is something I've struggled with for several years, mostly on the counterterrorism side of this coin, since Iran still is, we still consider Iran today to be the largest state sponsor of terrorism. But I think it applies to all aspects of Iran, or at least that's my impression. I actually don't believe it is knowable right now that we can actually foresee the road that we must walk, either as the United States or as an international community, to get to the goal you're describing or that the question poses. I don't think it's knowable. So that's why this answer is dissatisfying. I think I do know, or at least I think I can articulate an indispensable first step. We have to somehow restore and repair what once was an international community, a coordinated effort to reduce Iranian malign behavior.
What's an example?
We once had that. Well, one could argue, I would certainly argue, whatever the imperfections that the JPOA had, it did have broad international backing. Even some of our strategic adversaries had signed up for JPOA.
But it didn't deal with Iran in the region.
True. But see, here's the unknowable part. We'll never know now.
Right.
Had it continued, could it have become a platform upon which we achieved other values beyond simply reducing the likelihood that Iranian would create a weapon of mass destruction? We'll never know. But my view is, unless we can recreate something like it, it doesn't have to be another JPOA, but unless the United States exerts a degree of energy and enthusiasm for recreating some kind of credible international approach against Iran that maybe once again does even bring actors like Russia and China into the fold, I don't see how we ever get there. I'm dodging the question, obviously. I'm really not articulating what's the answer. I don't think we can know.
What about Obama's answer where he said these countries need to learn how to share the region?
Yeah, I wish that were true. I wish that were true. My own view is that the anticipating altruism by all the participants and competitors in this region is a fantasy. The much harder role is how does the United States, hopefully in concert with other allies and partners, create a paradigm, if you will, an intellectual and practical construct where everybody thinks they get enough from it. Enough of their interests are met that, however grudgingly, they'll cooperate. That's way harder than hoping for altruism, but it's also practical. I don't think the former is practical. And then finally, how do we use the current protests and political chaos in Lebanon to our potential advantage regarding Iran? This is, again, a blue problem. This is something General Votel knows very well. This is something I personally experienced when I was frequently going to Lebanon many years ago. There is a debate going on in the United States, particularly in Washington, D.C., about whether or not our generosity, which usually comes in the form of foreign assistance, security assistance, or just serious policy attention and relationship building with countries like Lebanon, is that important? There are people in this town who, and this precedes the current administration, I've been hearing this for several decades now, the people around the world really need to tend to their own backyards. We're tired of doing their heavy lifting. We got problems here at home, and we're just going to stop. Either they fix their own problems or we're not going to care. History has proven that every time we stop caring, we get hurt. Every single time. But we're still having an unfinished debate in this town about, and I'll get back to Lebanon here, and I'll use the specific idea of security assistance for something that's already been praised by several of the speakers here, the growing professionalism of the Lebanese armed forces, which I am a huge fan of. I used to participate in that. The number of times that I know General Votel has had to do this, many of my colleagues in State Department, in the Department of Defense, and elsewhere, even people in the region like the Israelis, already been mentioned here, have had to articulate, you want to reduce our support to the Lebanese armed forces?
Well, wasn't there a news story about a
nuts?
confusion on this recently? Are they going to withhold aid? Are they not? We're going to clarify, but they never clarified.
Yeah, but again, this is not unique. It made news recently, but this has been going on for a long time. And fortunately, the counter argument against reducing or ending the support to the Lebanese armed forces has been strong enough and consistent enough that we've not actually gone down that road, but we keep playing with it. And the fact that we're playing with it and still arguing about it is visible to the Lebanese. It is visible to everybody in the region. I suspect it's why that Israeli senior leader made that impassioned plea to General Votel many months ago. In some ways, they're more worried about our reduction of support to Lebanon than we are.
All right, so we're almost done. So 2 minutes. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask Mohammed a question about the GCC rift. If you could answer that in 15 to 30 seconds would be great. And then I want each of you really quickly, in 15 seconds or less, to say if there's one thing that can be done to reduce tensions or to de-escalate in the region, what is it and who can do it? But literally 15 seconds. But first, I'm going to go to the question, to Mohammed's question. Last year, the GCC-Qatar rift was a key discussion point. Are we still worried about this diplomatic crisis? Has it been managed? How do we re-engage these states when they have no incentives to be?
Okay, very short answer, and it's very personal assessment. I think the GCC rift has been sort of classified down in pathological terms from cancer to diabetes. So we're going to manage this as you manage diabetes. It's still problematic. It can take out your leg or your kidney, heaven forbid. But it's easy also to, it's very important to manage it. Live your life, have your diet, monitor your blood sugar, and then you might be fine.
Very interesting. All right, 15 seconds. Gunal, I'm going to start with you. What can be done to reduce tensions, de-escalate? Who can do it?
Well, the main driver of Turkey's destructive policies in the region has been domestic politics, and the country has turned to authoritarianism. And for a long time, particularly the United States turned a blind eye to whatever has been happening in Turkey domestically, saying that it's a NATO partner, the Kurdish question, it's its own domestic problem, it's a security problem, and ignored the democratic shortcomings. And I think we now know that now the US has to, the European countries as well, they really have to take what's happening inside of Turkey more seriously and engage the opposition and understand that Turkey is bigger than Erdogan, and there is a strong opposition. So Turkish democracy is struggling, but it's not dead yet, and it just needs help, particularly from the Western countries.
General Nagata.
All right, I think the most useful thing I can say is just to very quickly share this is a story. But it's a very brief story. But it's a story that I wish more American leaders in this town were seized by. It was the last conversation I had with a senior Kurdish leader in northern Iraq in 2016. It was the last time I was in Iraq. And I asked him during a very interesting conversation, because he clearly was tracking the political debates in this town. I said, so what happens if the United States leaves this region? What do you think happens? He started laughing. He said, oh, General Nagata, what happened after you left in 2011? You had to come right back. So if you leave now, I'm not worried. You'll be back.
All right. Hamad.
Basically, I think we need engagement from everyone. We need to talk to everyone. This was the problem with JCPOA, and I hope that we will not continue that again. Again, from the GCC parts, I think they would need to engage with everyone and understand better, but also put certain clear objectives and knowing that this can be achieved, but also can be monitored by others.
Thank you.
Quickly, one, engage in bottom-up confidence-building measures, small bottom-up confidence-building measures, to generate short-term benefits, to align leaders' incentive for cooperation. There is a low-hanging fruit in the economic cooperation field. And third, widen the aperture on security to focus on human security. There is too much emphasis, I think, when we talk about the region, on military security, whereas what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Lebanon, is really about basically drivers of human security.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, my panel, and thank you, the audience.